Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. Welcome. My name is Sarah Rafson. I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs here at the GSD. And on behalf of our team, which includes Matt Smith and Raquel Rivera, we're thrilled to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Sheila O'Donnell. Before we begin the program, I want to point out the land acknowledgement on screen. We invite you to take a moment to reflect on how foregrounding other histories, perspectives, and worldviews might shift your understanding of and obligations to the people and the land we're on, the people around us and the land we're on. We want to thank the Harvard University Native American program for their continuous work building relationships within and beyond the university to keep these questions at the forefront. I'd also like to note that we have live captioning available for tonight's lecture, so those of you who are joining virtually can enable captions by clicking on the closed captions icon at the bottom of the live stream window. And for those of you here in the theater with us, you can enable those captions using that QR code you see on the slide. If you have any questions or trouble activating that feature, go ahead and consult our colleagues in the AV booth, and they can give you a hand. I also want to invite you back to this theater for two upcoming events here at the GSD. On this Friday, November 15th, please join us for the Lobes Fellowship Symposium entitled A Round Table, Makers and Users. And then on Tuesday, November 19th, join guest editors Elizabeth Bowie-Cristoforetti and Jacob Riedel in a conversation to launch Harvard Design Magazine, issue number 52, Instruments of Service. So please check our website, gsd.harvard.edu/events, to find out more information about those events and others that are free and open to the public. And without further ado, join me in welcoming Grace Law, Chair of the Department of Architecture, who will introduce Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's my very distinct pleasure to introduce architect Sheila O'Donnell, founding partner of O'Donnell and Tuomey, the practice that she created with John Tuomey in 1988. Sheila has established herself as a leading voice in contemporary architecture, recognized not only for her innovative designs, but also for her thoughtful engagement with the cultural and historical context of the places where she builds. Something is moving. I don't want to mess up your slide. Something is moving on the screen. I was formally introduced to the work of O'Donnell and Tuomey about 20 years ago while visiting my husband's Irish cousin, the late Maeve Gardner, who had studied architecture with Sheila and John at University College Dublin. And she had kindly arranged a tour of their studio. Situated in a converted schoolhouse, the office contained mounds of books, drawings, and models, which were loosely organized by project, one group bleeding into the next, arrayed across a series of tables like hillocks in the rolling landscape of Ireland itself. John took us through the space, loosely narrating the seemingly disheveled arrangement of artifacts and revealing the undercurrents of exuberance fueling these collections as well as the studio's work. This tour gave us an insight into how the O'Donnell and Tuomey practice regards place as more than a physical phenomenon, but rather as a rich tapestry weaving together time, culture, climate, and society. At this time, James and I had our newly formed practice, and it was truly exciting to visit the O'Donnell and Tuomey office, also because we were eager to learn more about Sheila and John as practitioners. In the late 1980s, they had been part of the incredibly exciting Group 91, a consortium of 8 firms that consisted of 13 hungry local young architects. Group 91 came together to compete for the urban renewal project of Dublin's Temple Bar, a district that had been slated for demolition. Group 91 brainstormed a winning master plan that increased the public realm, interlacing several new cultural buildings into the existing urban fabric. This was critical to me for 2 reasons. One, it demonstrated the powerful potential of renewing the existing fabric through grafting and honing, that is to say, surgically adding to the context as well as polishing what was already there. These regenerative strategies push back against the tabula rasa presumption that demolishing and starting from scratch must be better. And 2, It proved that small, design-intensive practices could succeed in challenging the assumed hegemony of large-scale corporate design studios by providing a carefully studied and crafted proposal. The resulting constructions undoubtedly informed the trajectories of Group 91's architects, comprising many firms that are now considered international successes: Grafton Architects, McCullough Mulvin, Derek Tynan, Paul Keogh, Shane O'Toole, and of course, O'Donnell and Tuomey. Throughout the decades of Sheila's career, she and her practice have received numerous accolades, including the prestigious REBA Royal Gold Medal and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Brunner Prize, recognizing a lifetime of achievement in architecture. These honors reflect her profound impact on the field and her dedication to fostering a deeper understanding of architecture as a practice intimately tied to culture and place. O'Donnell and Tuomey's commitment to seeking simplicity, born from complexity, yields nuanced buildings that harmonize with their surroundings without sacrificing their fresh, well-grounded identity. In their architectural methodology, the ethos of designing from the ground up and from the inside out reveals the rich potentialities in the historical layers of a place, while innovatively addressing the needs of its present and future inhabitants. A recent project by O'Donnell and Tuomey, Three Rambling Houses, provides a provocative example of a contemporary approach to vernacular knowledge, and this project is comprised of 3 deceptively simple pavilions modeled after traditional Irish gathering places for music making and storytelling. They are located in an open field, as such structures were in old Irish villages, welcoming passers-by at any hour of the day or night, and they remain programmatically flexible. The architectural forms of the Three Rambling Houses appear familiar in the pitches of their roofs, and yet otherworldly in their levitation from the ground plane and in their abstract prismatic sensibilities. By using traditional local building materials of stone, timber, and thatch, the project reminds us that we might look to ancient practices and natural materials, even as we strive to create designs oriented toward the present and the future. This evening, I hope to hear from Sheila about how this form making came about, along with her many accomplished projects. And as we prepare to listen, we might reflect on the value of drawing from lessons of the past while innovating for the future. How can we ensure that our buildings resonate not just as visually compelling structures, but also as meaningful contributions to the communities and places that they inhabit? Please join me in welcoming Sheila O'Donnell as she shares her insights on these enduringly timely matters of design.
Thank you, Grace. I feel you've given my lecture. I scarcely need to say anything here, but I will. I'm going to start by reading a part of the lecture, and then after that I will just talk to the slides. But I just wanted to read an introduction as I go through the first slides. And I'm going to talk about recent work that I've made with my partner John Tuomey under this title, Conversations with Place. Our work is deeply engaged with place in how to respond to the particular characteristics of each site, but also in how to make places within our buildings. We're interested in making places between inside and outside, where the presence of a building reaches further than its physical boundaries, outside the limits of its site, to the world beyond, at least until it meets the buildings and spaces that surround it or the landscape that defines it. Places where the building and the site become one. Every inhabited place is defined by and read through its buildings and its constructed landscapes. We converse with space in a number of different ways, which include representations of place and memories of places, which may or may not be accurate. Memory gives us ownership, and what we own is our own impression, which is real. Place is not just a physical phenomenon, it also includes aspects of time, culture, ethos, essence, and of course, society. We talk about our buildings being designed from the ground up and from the inside out. And in that context, I think of both ground and inside as being aspects of place. When everything is in its place, everything is good. We're not looking for abstracted perfection or ideal forms. Our designs are derived from careful study of constraints by a process of close noticing of local conditions. The idea is to arrive at a form that speaks back to and makes sense of its situation. to approach a deeper sort of simplicity through acceptance of the complicated origins that make up the shape of things. Our university building in Budapest, which you see here, is embedded within and between existing buildings. It talks to them in many ways. This image is of a visual conversation with its 19th century neighbour. By using the same material and by pulling back from the street line to give a pocket of space, the new building invites the old one into its world. In Cork, the Glucksman Gallery floats above the ground in response to the trees, protecting their roots while allowing the branches to brush the windows of the building. The gallery is raised up on concrete columns, cantilevered like a tree on its trunk, and a path through the site passes under the building, allowing you to be in it and outside it at the same time. In Connemara, the new structures of our furniture college respond to the texture and matter of the mountains. They lean with the direction of the wind, and they're lifted off the ground to allow the constant rain to flow under them to the bog below. Understanding the sense of place in a place or a site is always a starting point in our work. We also aim to bring to our work a sense of place learned from other places. The landscape writer Tim Robinson, who I'll talk about later, has said that it's the basic act of attention that makes a place out of a location. And to me, this idea of the act of attention partly defines the architect's task. There are some places which we keep revisiting because of the intensity and certainty of their sense of place. We walk through the constructed landscapes of Greece and Ireland, looking at walls, terraces, hilltop forts. We feel a strong sense of similarity between these two landscapes and between their archaic vernacular cultures and sensibilities. But of course, we also know that the similarity may be in our own way of looking, absorbing and understanding these places. Tiny chapels in stony landscapes, where a simple seat or a step defines the threshold and establishes a sacred arrival place, while the pure white form is built into the rocky landscape behind. Vernacular chapels are situated in their landscape with the same certainty as the classical structures in Delphi. Whitewash unifies the forms. It becomes the material they're made of. We're always looking at steps, seats, at how these elements mediate between building and ground. We enjoy the zigzag geometry of a West of Ireland pier with its rough board-marked concrete, the grass growing on its surface. And sometimes the man-made makes use of the natural. A concrete promenade uses a natural rock outcrop to define containment. They become one. Or the natural can take on the guise of the man-made. Here in the Aran Islands, the sea cuts a perfectly rectangular pool in a limestone platform. The ancient quarry of Ignatia is man-made, but it has been claimed by the sea and by time, becoming part of the landscape. This noticing grounds us in the everyday. These simple structures celebrate the ordinariness and specialness of a threshold. Irish tower houses, ubiquitous throughout our Western landscape, have always fascinated us. We were surprised to find a whole town of these familiar structures in the south of the Mani Peninsula in mainland Greece. The small house in Navan is a tower house and a hill town. Two buildings arranged around a court. It cuts into the ground and it rises above it. Hose House and Ranelagh School, both designed at the same time, are concerned with building the site, cutting and filling to navigate level changes and to connect the building to its ground. The school site is small, so new ground is made on the roof, where a light timber and steel structure provides covered outdoor space for learning and play. At ground level, the veranda and corridor act as a single space between inside and outside, where the building and the site become one, a contingent space where people can pause before committing to enter. Similarly, the London School of Economics Student Centre pulls back from its site boundary, creating a civic threshold covered by a glazed canopy, inside-outside space. The folded, canted and faceted form of this building is a response to rights of light and other site restrictions, and it's tailored in response to specific lines of sight along the narrow lanes that approach it. So I'm going to talk now about the first theme is conversations with real and imagined places. We first came across Canaletto's Capriccio Palladiano in Aldo Rossi's Architecture of the City. Canaletto assembled a collection of built and unbuilt designs by Palladio in a pictorial composition, and then he sited them all in Venice in a kind of imaginary setting. And Rossi referred to this image as being an illustration of his concept of the analogous city. And we felt that this painting might also be a sort of description of what happens with a Venice Biennale, where different ideas by different architects are collected together and brought together in the context of Venice to make a kind of new architecture that temporarily exists within that city. And whenever we've made a number of installations in Venice, and it's always a kind of interesting challenge to think about the idea of an exhibition of architecture, and I think we've always felt that our exhibitions should be architecture as well as being about architecture. So in 2018, Grafton invited us to their free space, and we made an installation in the Corderia which brought together two projects we were working at the time. We called it Folding Landscape East and West, and it brought together a very big competition in China and a very small project in the west of Ireland into one structure. The project in the west of Ireland, the Robinson Research Centre, is built around the house and garden of a wonderful man, Tim Robinson, who I mentioned earlier. And in a way, this project is about a place and about a person. The place is Roundstone, a small village on the coast, which is actually a planned town. Alexander Nimmo, a Scottish engineer, went around the west of Ireland building piers. And in the case of this one, he also planned a single-sided street which faces out to the sea, which is a kind of straight street in plan, but because of the topography, it becomes a quite complex three-dimensional form. And this village has always attracted writers and painters, including Gerard Dillon in the mid-20th century, who made this very beautiful painting of the town. And then towards the end of the 20th century, Tim Robinson, a polymath, an Englishman who's an artist, a mathematician, a writer, and eventually a cartographer, moved into the house on the end of the pier in Roundstone, from which he made his maps and wrote his books about landscape. And the way that his books about landscape are absolutely wonderful, and they've changed our way of seeing and understanding our own landscape. The house that he lived in is at the end of the pier on the left. In a way, it's the most kind of discreet and yet the most visible house in the town. He left his house and its garden to the University of Galway because he had no children, and he had started holding a set of what he called colloquia, conversations about landscape, about science, about art in this house, contributed to by the university. So he left the house to the university. And our project was to make a research centre commissioned by the university, which would bring together writers, artists, would have space for exhibition and display as well as conversation, and a small number of studios for writers or artists. Tim is most famous for the maps he made of the west of Ireland. The one on the right there is one of his maps of the Aran Islands. He made 3 maps, but he felt that the existing very beautiful 19th century Ordnance Survey maps were inaccurate because they were made by the English Army, who translated in a very crude way the Irish place names into English. So Tim learned the Irish language on the Aran Islands so that he could make a map that corrected the place names as they should be in the Irish language. So there's a really interesting relationship between place and history and names, and how much the names are important in the history. And when we went there with our students, our students made a survey of his house, which was kind of equivalent to the maps he made of the landscape. And they recorded everything in the house: tables, bottles, lamps, books, stones on the windowsill, in order to make a kind of map of the life that Tim and his wife, Mairead, who is this wonderful couple, who lived there in a kind of genteel poverty in this wonderful house, looking out over the harbour and the mountains. So our starting point was to make some sketches. I made these sketches on the site, thinking about how to integrate the existing building, which was the engineer Nimmo's original storehouse, and how to add new things to it, and how that would relate to the views to the site and views from the site. And as often happens, in the middle of thinking about this project, we went on holidays to Greece, which we do most years, and we brought some sketches with us, and we worked on just the thinking about what is this project about. And I found these different stones on one of the islands, a very hard obsidian and a light tufa, and made these paintings, and thinking about how nature and time form and make shapes of things. And then we ended up using those stones to make a kind of model. So we had pencils and sketches and rubbers and erasers and sharpeners. So we ended up making sketches and making a model which used stones and pencils and a pencil sharpener to represent the forms of the building. We sent photographs back to the office and they started setting up drawings. And we eventually drew this project, which was to retain the old house as a meeting room and cafe, and then to add a big room for collections of people and exhibitions, and then a little line of studios along the boundary. And that these buildings will be made in a timber structure with a kind of crushed shell render sitting right on the edge of the sea wall of the site, almost like big sails looking visible from the sea, and would be a place people would come and learn and connect with each other. And the big space had these two big roof lights which brought light down for exhibition or for meeting. And when we came to make the installation in Venice, we brought together this project and the Opera House in Shanghai, one at a scale of 1 to 2, one at a scale of 1 to 10, and made them into a kind of single structure, which was a piece of architecture. So in a way, it was about these two projects, but really it was also about the space in the Corderia. So you could say, from this sketch, it was one of the sketches I made, it was about making a stairs that you could walk up so you could see out the window in the Corderia, because Grafton Architects opened all the windows for that biennale, but they're very high up. So in a way, our project, in one way, was just a stairs up and a stairs down that you could look out the window. But it also was a reflection of these two projects, and it also was a conversation with the simple white structures in the Greek landscape, which we were looking at the time we were making this study about how these things sit in the land, in the rocks. So this installation sits between the columns, is a kind of dynamic in the sense that you can walk and move through it. People could walk up and down the stairs, but it also contained exhibition material for the two projects being shown. So it's a kind of plaything and a serious project at the same time, and it's all white and comes to the ground with seats and steps, as do the Greek chapels that we are so fond of. Conversations with maps. I'm fascinated by maps. I love the sort of power of maps, which are the same thing as plans, but sometimes have more information, and in particular, the Nolli plan of Rome, which I suppose we're all very familiar with. And what I love about the Nolli plan is that while it's a flat, two-dimensional drawing, because of the way he works the spaces, because of the way it's shaded, because the public buildings are drawn in plan, it somehow has a really strong spatial definition. You can feel the sense of the enclosures of compression and release in the city of Rome. So whenever we go to Rome, I bring photocopies, and every day I draw the path I take through the city in a coloured pencil, and then I use another colour the next day. So I gradually build up a kind of tapestry and a record of where I've walked. And in a way, the map is a record, but it's also a kind of prediction. So in the evening, I look at the map and think, oh, there's a whole area I've never been to. We must go there tomorrow. And also you can see the places that we go to often, or I make little notes about spaces that are very interesting. And what's amazing about this map, drawn in 1768, I think, is that it's still almost completely accurate in the Campo Marzio, where this area is. And little angled spaces are still there, and often you can see the shapes by looking up at the sky better than you can on the ground. And I think it's also a lesson in how to make space, how a tiny shift in angle has a huge impact in reality. So, never wanting to be idle on holidays, I also got interested in somehow trying to record the way I swim around the harbour in this Greek island, which I find was a kind of interesting way of, first of all, maybe a bit obsessive, kind of defining where I go on one day and then deciding, well, I better swim around a different boat tomorrow. But it's also something about experiencing being in a condition, water, which is not air and it's not solid, it's something in between, that you're sort of suspended in aquatic space, and the boats are slightly moving, and I feel it was a way of trying to record and trying to project forward into how to make spaces between things, how things can feel like they're moving even when they're static. And in Venice, the amazing thing in Venice is that these public routes, there's no cars. So this image of the map and the photograph is the route from the Accademia to the Frari, two of the biggest tourist destinations in Venice. And the final part of the walk is down this little calle Stretta Lipoli. And it looks like a closed street, and there's a tiny gap, 900 millimeters wide on the side, which is how you move through to then the huge space which has the Frari. And I think that there are so many lessons to learn from looking at how these European cities, particularly Venice and Rome, have an incredible spatial sense about opening and closing, compression, release, a kind of acoustic space they make by enclosure. And in some of our first buildings, the Irish Film Institute, which is woven into a city block in between a whole set of existing buildings, is intending to make those kind of spaces where something feels big because you've just come through somewhere narrow to get to it, or where a route goes from darkness to light. A building we built in Derry for an Irish Music and Language Centre had a site with only one opening on a narrow front to the street, and the rest was closed. So we made a kind of set of routes through to a high space in the middle, which brings daylight into the building and is in itself also a kind of campo. So we've been lucky enough to do quite a lot of projects in old buildings, in existing buildings, and I really enjoy that sense of conversation with old buildings and the transformation and what you have to learn from them. So this project in Budapest was a competition for the Central European University, and it was a three-phase project, only one phase of which was built for reasons which I'll explain. But the first phase was to make one new and one old building, to transform one old building and make a new building. And in the new building, we used a lot of bricks reclaimed from some demolitions on this site and others. And so we're trying to have always a conversation between the old and the new, between the materials of the old and new. The university was located in a wonderful site in the middle of Pest, which is the neoclassical flat side of Budapest, in a set of 5 adjoining but not connected buildings making up a large part of a city block. And our aspiration in the drawing on the left was to connect the university to itself and connect it to the city, because what we found when we went there was that it was disconnected. The buildings were beside each other but not connected. And Budapest is a very different city from London and Dublin, which are the ones we know best, because it's made up of big buildings, 25 metres wide, always around courtyards. So it's a city of courtyards, and we did a lot of research into different sizes and shapes of courtyards, buildings that had many courtyards. And then we looked at our site, which is this is the survey drawing with these big, heavy black walls between each property, which were not ever opened through. And we had the idea of making a set of connected, that our project would be about courtyards, that we would keep the existing buildings where they were still in good state, and we would open up the courtyards and open up the buildings to each other and to the city. So the most important drawing I think we made was this one, where we simply put a lot of red arrows, so that instead of being like this, we said, okay, so we're going to make all these connections and it's going to become one place, and the outdoor courtyards are going to become part of the life of the university. Budapest has a very extreme climate with plus 40 degrees Celsius in summer and minus 20 in the winter. So they were never in the courtyards. They were either too cold or too hot, and they weren't part of the life of the university. So our project was, where we were keeping the existing buildings, to put new courtyards over them, and then to make courtyards in our new buildings. And in thinking about how to open up and connect, there's lots of things in the mind always. There's beautiful spaces in Rome, the Portico d'Ottavio, where layers of time and history are built up, but that these connected archways still move through old buildings that come from the ancient, the Renaissance, the Baroque, and the modern in the case of a little taverna. And thinking about Gordon Matta Clark's conical intersect on the site of the Pompidou Centre in Paris, the buildings that were going to be demolished, he made this amazing project where he made conical cuts through adjoining buildings, giving this incredible sense suddenly of connection between things which were always not supposed to be connected. And in a way, these party walls reminded us of our site in Budapest. So our aspiration was to cover the courtyards, bring them into the life of the university, and then make these cuts through between the old buildings to make a connected, an interconnected and disentangled university, because it was an incredibly entangled place. And sometimes this was an early competition sketch on the left that I made about the idea that where we were working with an existing building, because there were a lot of rooms around the courtyards, that we would make connections into the courtyard itself, that the stairs would be expressed in the courtyard and the rooms would be left intact. And that is how that part of the project worked out. This section is very focused in, but it goes through on your left, the existing building, which we have radically transformed, and on the right, our new building. The big angled roof on the existing building was a result of a lot of work on a kind of climatic conditions in this building, in this climate. And the shape of the roof is designed so that air is brought up and sucked out in the summer, and the building is cool enough to use. It also was a response to faculty members not wanting their offices to open into a covered over space because they didn't want to be listening to student parties in the courtyards. So we got this big angled roof through which stairs connect. And on the right is our new building, which is a library at the top, convention and meeting centre in the middle, and then a big lecture hall at the bottom. So as you move through the building, in the old building here, you see that the stairs connect through and come out through the glass roof. At the top, we built a roof garden because there was no outdoor space in the university, which has outdoor classes, has vegetable garden, has places to sit and among trees and to have shade and sunshine. And then at the bottom, there's a new entrance with a window looking down to the lecture hall, which is below the street. And our two buildings, on the left, the new building, which is now the new main entrance to the university, has a spiral stairs talking to all the many spiral staircases all over Budapest. On the right, the old building with its rectangular courtyard roofed over. And here you see where the old bricks that are recycled in the new building. And as you move up through, you're looking down over spaces, and also you're looking through walkways into the existing building. And all the time we're trying to make connections that the red box is where a corridor in the old buildings comes through and breaks into the wall of the new and looks to the courtyard of the library. And the library is a multi-storey space, which at the top has its own roof light, its own courtyard, with timber slatting on the walls to acoustically control it, and then with lots of different kinds of spaces, like windows that look down the street to the Danube, places that are roof lit so that students can choose different types of environment to study in. And then the thing that was really important to us was the idea that there was a new front door to the university, and we were very excited that the street that is on axis with our new building goes down to the Danube, which somehow in our minds is a kind of romantic river, a sense of kind of old Europe on the Danube. So the new building can be seen at the end of that vista, and it's indeed visible from across the river in Buda. So the university now has its public face to the town. And the building is, the front of the building is made in a local limestone, which is the limestone that all of the buildings in that part of Budapest are made from. And you see here that the context is of these very muscular, very three-dimensional buildings with big balconies, with projecting bay windows, with recesses. And we wanted to have a kind of conversation with that sense of three-dimensionality. And we went to the quarry outside the city which has been in use since Roman times, where this limestone was quarried, and we were able to select the exact stone that would be used in our building. It's quite a thick cladding, it's about 80 millimetres, so that there are holes in the stone, but so that it doesn't feel thin and friable, but it has a kind of substantial weightiness. And then there is this idea that by having these recesses and setbacks, the library faces west, so these are louvers that shade the spaces from sunlight, but there are also recesses that bring in the building across the road, which is made in the same material, with the sense that our building will eventually weather to be like that stone across the road. So the building was finished, and the second phase was about to start on site, which is the bit on the left, which is a kind of faculty office building on the opposite street. And just before we started on site, it all came to a sorry end because, sorry, the slide's not moving forward. Yep. The Hungarian government, which is increasingly what they describe themselves as an illiberal democracy, the Central European University was seen as a kind of enemy. George Soros is connected with this university, so Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister, brought in a law which effectively closed down the Central European University. So it's had to move to Vienna, and our building is, well, it is still in use, but the main university is now, and the second phase, of course, has not happened. In Liverpool, we won a competition to make a new School of Architecture, which is in addition to an existing set of buildings which already has two phases, or three, you might say. And we were particularly interested in this project because both John and I worked for James Sterling in the late 70s and 80s, and he is a kind of mentor. And some aspects of the way we work in our practice is very influenced by the way that Jim worked in his practice. And we felt this, so Liverpool was his university, and he felt a very strong connection with it. And we felt that in making this competition, we were having a conversation with him, a posthumous conversation with Jim, and we wanted to somehow work in the way that he works and also to respond to the existing buildings. On the left is the building that was built in the 1930s, and beyond that is the Georgian original school. This is a kind of remarkable photograph of the year that Jim Sterling graduated. And we look at this photograph and we wonder, how did Jim Sterling know he was Jim Sterling the year he was graduating? Because all the students are sitting in a bank at the back, and he's sitting at the front, in front of the flower box on his own. So, I mean, there was a kind of funny character to the old building. We really liked this building, but there was a sort of odd extension built in the 80s, which we had hoped to be able to change, but the budget doesn't allow that. But the corner window was one thing. Our site was to build on to the end of that modernist building. And we really wanted to keep the corner window, which we felt was important. So we started to think about how we would respond to this place. And the drawings we made in the competition, we made them, I would say, with conscious reference to the kind of drawings that Sterling made, his most famous drawings, his axonometrics, his worm's eye views, thinking about ourselves in that kind of conversation. And in fact, Andrew America, who's here tonight, who's a student in the landscape school here, was working with us and made some of the drawings that I'm going to show. I'm not sure if he made that one, but he certainly made some of the next ones. So we went back to really understand the site, to make these sketches, the history of the three buildings, the culture of the place, the history of who had been there, and the relationship with the modern monuments like the modern cathedral in Liverpool. And then we were very interested in the idea of space and the kind of spaces you would have in a school of architecture. And the top of the building is one big studio overlapping with different platforms with a very big timber structure, a 30-metre roof span, which is about to be constructed quite soon. The base has been constructed. And with the idea that the studio is the heart of any school of architecture and that that's where the conversations and the discussions happen. And then at the bottom of the building, we're also thinking about designing, as Grace has said, from the inside out. So we set back our new entrance to allow that corner, which is on the bottom of the plan there, to allow the corner of the old building to survive intact as a kind of corner window. And then the lower floor is a forum, a place for meeting, a place for discussions with big stairs up to the studios. And then as you come to the top of the building, you're in this timber structured roof space. And then a lot of the project was about making small connections with the existing, with the old building, because it all starts from the plan, as we say. And we had to connect, make sort of incisions, make splices into the old buildings, both the Georgian and the 1930s building, in plan and in section, to try and make a meaningful whole, that all three parts are built in brick, but our part has got a bigger scale timber windows and is in its own conversation with the place as well as with the existing buildings. I'm thinking some of these might be Andrew's drawings here, that we did these tectonic drawings looking up into the structure, the materiality, the experience. The interesting thing, this was designed in 2018, and we've always had in our practice an interest in the environment, in the use of robust materials, in natural ventilation and light, in thermal mass. And at the point we designed this, energy use was still the kind of main discussion about climate. Very soon afterwards it changed to being the embodied carbon of materials. But at this point we were still thinking, and I think we still do believe in a sense, that long-living, robust buildings are sustainable buildings because they will last a long time and they will not have to be rebuilt. So the building sits on this corner, angled to face the old cathedral, and is under construction at the moment, and it's just about to come to, the timber structure is just about to go on. The next one is a very different context, a conversation. I'm describing it as a new urban place in London. So we did a competition in 2015 in partnership with Allies and Morrison in London and Arquitecturia in Spain to make a new cultural and residential quarter on the site of the London Olympics. On a kind of strange site, so that you can see the huge stadium, you see the park, and the very, very narrow sliver of land was the site for 600 residential units and 4 cultural buildings. So by definition, this was going to be a very tall, very dense development. And we worked together, the 3 practices, on how to respond to a place that in a way had been remade for the Olympics. So this is the historic map of what used to be there, industrial buildings which stretched between a river and a road and a railway. But then when the Olympics were held there, they put in they built a kind of upper level, pedestrian connection above the real ground 8 metres below, and parcels of land were connected by bridges and walkways. And this was the context into which we had to make this cultural quarter. And we were thinking all the time about moving between buildings, about the relationships between being above and looking down to below, and that the site was very densely occupied, so it was always going to be buildings close together with spaces between. These are some of our study models. And the final development is of the residential is at the northern end of the site on the left here. And this is a kind of X-ray drawing of the 8 buildings which are making up the development. And the ones in red are the ones that we're working on in our practice. So on the left is a building called the Prow, a residential tower, which is the kind of the tower that closes the end of the residential. In the middle is the Victoria and Albert Museum, and on the right, Sadler's Wells Theatre. And we've been working on these buildings now for 10 years, and they've been through iterations and reiterations and are almost finished. The Prow, the housing building, is the last to go, and we're just at planning stage with that now, and we're working on a building which is made in a kind of terracotta or cast red material, which is referencing back to the history of London mansion blocks, and trying to use a kind of 3-story scale to give a secondary level of human scale to a building which is quite tall. And this drawing, this image is, I suppose, about the fact that this place is experienced by people in trains and cars and automobiles looking from a distance towards the development. But what is the cultural part of the development is these 4 buildings. The nearest one, the red one, Sadler's Wells Theatre, is a building we've designed which is almost finished. 2 buildings in the middle by Allies and Morrison, BBC and the College of Fashion, and then the V&A Museum on the left, and they all face into this river. And Sadler's Wells is the building that holds the corner at the upper level of this pedestrian bridge, which you see those people standing on. And it's a building for all aspects of dance. It's a building for performance, for creation of dance, for experimentation and for teaching. So it has an auditorium, a flexible auditorium, 6 dance studios, cafes and bars, and places for students to relate. And this section, which is very small but gives a sense of the site conditions, on the right is Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Centre, which is our next door neighbour. And at the level of that is the public entrance to our building. And 8 metres below that on the left is the level of the stage where the get-in and the technical back of house occurs. So the building kind of spans between these 2 levels. And we were trying, the clients are fantastic people, and they just wanted the building to be, as they said, ready for work and robust and straightforward. And we were trying to think, how do you express a building which has 6 studios and a big auditorium, all of which are by definition rectangular spaces? And that was very clearly stated by the client. A dance studio has right angle corners, don't even think about anything else. So we were looking at notations for choreography and thought that maybe we could by making these sawtooth roofs at the studios, which are in 2 ranges wrapped around the auditorium and the fly tower, could be like a sort of get their own rhythm, like the dancing steps as you kind of dance around the 2 sides of this space, so that you get the fly tower and the auditorium are very rectangular, and then these studios have a different kind of expression. And then at the public level, there's big windows everywhere and a canopy, which we think theatres have to have canopies. And then we're thinking about the material quality, that it's a kind of building that feels like it's carved out of a big block of something. So it's a brick building, and it is in very much a conversation with the industrial past of this site, the sawtooth roofs, the scale of the chimney behind, the section showing that the studios, one of which is left out at the bottom so that the public foyer has a view up into the school above. And then where the auditorium is, the really tall fly tower, because dance uses an awful lot of 3-dimensional sets, etc. And then the small space for the audience, which is retractable, with another public studio on the top floor looking out over Zaha's building. And in a way, the only really public space in this building is the foyer, and it's an L-shaped space which is accessed at 2 corners on the 2 sides, which are publicly available, and it wraps around the core of the auditorium, and then crusted around the auditorium are all the storage, the kitchens, the public toilets, the facilities that are needed. And then we wanted to make the foyer have a kind of complexity that would allow people to find their own little nooks and crannies, different corners to be in. At the biggest corner, it has a community dance floor, which is visible by people looking in through the windows. So it's a single space, but it's a kind of multi-use space with the idea that it could be occupied by a small number or a big number of people at the same time. And it's just coming to completion. These are site photographs taken last week. The brick of the outside wraps its way around this public face of the foyer, defining the kind of cranked space that it comes in one door and goes out the other. And then the foyer has this high space where the pupils and students can look down and the public can look up. And the rhythm of the structure of the studios above gives a kind of measure to the cafes below. And then you see the big canopy, which is a way of screening and giving an outdoor space that's covered outside the auditorium, and it also gives a visual screening for some of the studios. So it's a kind of it's a very straightforward square planned building. The studios sit on either side of the circulation, and then on the north side, which is in this axonometric, it's completely blank because it's the auditorium and it's the fly tower. And we were really trying to think, how do you make a wall that has no windows? How do you work with this? And then in a visit to Rome, the Aurelian walls suddenly became a series of fly towers to us. And we thought, okay, well, you sculpt the brickwork, you think about ways in which the functions in the building can give a kind of form, a kind of three-dimensionality. And we worked with these brickmakers in Italy near Venice to get with the client. And so on the side of the blank side, we have a cranked staircase coming up from below. We have the chimney that ventilates the studios. The roofs of the studios are also made in the same clay as the walls, so it's a kind of brick mountain. And those forms are just completing on site now. As you cross the bridge to face the building, you see more of this kind of brick articulating the entrances, the studios. And in a sense, I think it's just, it's a very normative, straightforward building because the client wanted this idea ready to work, approachable, and instead of saying the name of the building, it says, "You are welcome" over the door. And in a way, that was the kind of ethos, the starting point for the whole project. At the other end of this collection of buildings is the V&A Museum, which we're also designing. The V&A is a 5-story museum. It's on quite a small site, and each of its floors has a public use, so the public move all the way up through all 5 floors. And it straddles the upper level, which Sadler's Wells opens from, and the lower original ground, because there's a riverside space in front of it. So it's a building with 2 entrances. And from early on, it was clear that V&A is a design museum. It has a large collection of objects. This building will emphasize objects that come from the communities who are by now traditional residents of the East End of London, people from different parts of Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. So they will, V&A East, as it's called, will emphasize that aspect of their collection. But it was not going to be a building where the windows show you what's inside. So we were always looking for, the building in itself is almost like an object in the collection of the V&A. It's another object. And we were trying to think, how do you make a building which feels like it's a kind of casket? It's a precious box that contains things. And we've always been interested in this wonderful Wim Wenders film about Yohji Yamamoto called Notebook on Cities and Clothes. And there's a great scene where Wim Wenders puts on a jacket and a shirt designed by Yohji Yamamoto, and he says that he felt different in it. And he said he had the strangest sensation. I had no other words for it. I was wearing the shirt itself and the jacket itself, and in them I was myself. I was protected like a knight in armour. So the idea that somehow the relationship between a piece of clothes and the body, that the clothes are a kind of armour, they're another layer which allows something to express itself without exposing everything about your inner self. At the same time we were designing this, we were looking at this in the Dublin National Gallery, this beautiful Vermeer painting, and I got somehow fascinated by the sleeve of this woman's dress and the sense, first of all, of the incredible geometric form that Vermeer had painted into this sleeve, and the sense that there was such a big space between the woman's arm and the sleeve, and that could be something about how in the middle of our building there's the galleries, and then around that there's a space where people move, where the staircases, where there are cafes and shops, and that somehow what Japanese call the ma, the space between the body and the outside. And this became the concept of the building. So we worked with models to think about how we would wrap a kind of form around the box that was the exhibition spaces inside. And around the same time, there was an exhibition in the V&A of Balenciaga, the Spanish fashion designer, who made these amazing dresses which were very sculptural and in a way stood very much away from the body. And in that exhibition, there were some x-rays of dresses, which we got really interested in the idea that you could x-ray a dress. And we were trying to make drawings which were like x-raying the building, that in the middle are the exhibition spaces, and then around the edges this other world of the kind of Dhamma, as we call it. So it eventually evolved into this form where all the stairs and all the public spaces are inside the kind of crinkled crust. And then the building has two entrances. So at the lower level, you enter from the square into the cafe. And that's also the level where all the art and objects are brought into a yard at the back. So it's a kind of busy entrance floor. And then the other entrances from the podium level. So the two entrances are connected by one of the staircases that's inside this in-between space. And that's where the big windows in the building are, also that the windows are not open into the galleries except in one or two places where the light is controlled, but generally they're in the movement spaces. And then as you move up through the building, you are in public space on the outside and galleries and exhibition space in the middle. And the stairs brings you backwards and forwards depending on the direction and where the entrance to a particular gallery is. And there are windows and views out from that stairs. So the stairs is dynamic, and then the exhibition spaces are there to be completely transformed by whatever exhibition is on. There's one big changing exhibition space, and the others will be curated for lengths of time. And we got very involved in how to make this crust, how to make this jacket that wraps around the building that goes up through. So what we've made is this, it's made in precast concrete, which we realized is actually a very crafted material, because precast concrete is made in a workshop. The molds are made in timber. So what we did was we drew lines and a series of different kinds of geometric lines on the outside of the building, which are three-dimensionally cast into the panels of precast. And some of these are projecting and indented V's and A's, which I don't think the V&A know that, but that's what we were thinking. And we were looking at the old V&A, the existing building in South Kensington, and how elaborated its walls and its entrances are, sometimes in terracotta with little animals carved. And we wanted the feeling that the kind of jacket around the building was also worked and had its own, expressed something about the fact that this is a building which contains works of craft, works that are carefully made, works that are precisely made. So we made these drawings trying to work out exactly the shape. So the drawing on the right is the folded out facade of all the panels that are going to be in the building. And then you see up close some of the lines and marks that are indented into these panels. And these are samples, and then they're eventually built into the building. And you can see here how the lines and moves around the building. Because of the way it's built, the outside of this building is now finished. The walls and the windows are done, but it'll be another at least a year while the internal fit out of the galleries, the shops, the cafe, which we're working on now, happen. There's a kind of strange feeling of people saying, oh, your V&A is finished, when's it opening? We're saying, well, actually, no, it's not going to be open for at least a year. So it's sitting there in this landscape of this kind of three-dimensional landscape, which is where you deal with the level change between the two parts of the site. And there's a planted landscape looking back over to the Queen Elizabeth Park. Sorry. And this is the building as seen from the park where the lower level entrance will be. So it'll be at least a year before we're doing that. I've always painted, made watercolour paintings, and in recent, well, for many years, of mountains, mostly in the west of Ireland. And I tend to abstract these mountains and these landscapes. So these are not all painted on one page, they're all on separate pages, but there's different paintings of basically the same set of mountains as light and temperature and seasons change them. And I'm really interested in the idea of observing the kind of material quality, the light and the form of these big solid objects. And to me, they're part of my work, because they're a way of stopping and looking and thinking about form, thinking about light, thinking about scale. And I sit in the window in our house in the west of Ireland and paint mountains. And in a way, they influence then the way that I might think about, say, the example here of a house we designed near Dublin, which has a rocky outcrop on the site, and I painted the rocks. And in a way, that almost leads into the form of the building growing out of that. Or the housing project in Dublin that we built, where in order to kind of summarise the main things, which were to make a wall with recesses for gardens and projecting steps, that I use watercolour drawings as a way of kind of making something diagrammatic, but keeping its material and character sense at the same time. So this has always been something that I've done as part of the work. And then when the lockdown came and we couldn't leave the city, I started painting trees. And in those paintings in the west of Ireland, I never put in the foreground because I found it too distracting and too complicated, and I just wanted to do the big forms. And then suddenly, all I could see was trees, so I had to start painting trees, and I got a bit obsessed with this fig tree that I painted over about a month. And then the leaves started coming out, and I had to paint the leaves separately because otherwise I would have had to go back and change the whole thing. But I found it was another way of looking and thinking about structure and form and time, because the little acer tree that changed across the seasons as we still stayed at home, locked down. And then eventually I started grouping them together, maybe doing a few trees and a rock, or trees and another tree behind. And I realised that by just putting something like, in this case, a watering can in among the trees, that it kind of changed it spatially. And I was interested in thinking about how that might be in work and how layers might be. And around the same time, because we were locked in and working from home, and John particularly was working on the stair landing, we came back to a project we've been talking about for many years. We live in a house that we bought 32 years ago, and we bought it because there was a site we could build a studio at the end of the garden. So in the lockdown, we thought we better build that studio. I mean, if we don't do it soon, we're never going to build it. And also, we thought it would be better than working on a landing. And there are very particular conditions in this garden. One is that there's an amazing church, which is visible in that photo, that we have a view to from our garden. And the other is that the levels change. At the end of the garden, the level drops to the lane behind. So we had to navigate this level change. And that's quite an interesting condition for us, the idea of things being cut in. And we are always looking at old buildings. And this is an amazing church in Glendalough, just south of Dublin. It's actually a ruin. But what I really love here is that you're walking among these walls, which have so much grass and green growing on top of them, that you're not quite sure what's man-made, what's natural, what's cut in. And just the sense of moving between layers and the sense of enclosure of low walls was something we were thinking about when we had to dig our studio in at the bottom of the garden. And also wanting to keep the view to the dome. And the section, which is very small, but shows the level changes with the dome just going out of the picture on the right. So the building is a simple mono-pitch with the lowest bit facing into the garden and the higher bit up to the dome, so we could keep the view, and also so we could have a view from inside to the dome. And for years we were sketching and thinking about a square building on the site, and we had planted a stand of birch trees when we bought the house as a kind of just to hold the space until we got round to building the studio, and we were going to take them down and build a studio in the space where they are. And you can, some of them are underneath the bits of the plan and this, but then in the lockdown, when I started moving down the garden in my paintings and thinking about the layers of the garden and the importance of these birch trees that can be seen through other trees, and then are these amazing kind of white things against the sky and against the buildings beyond, we decided we couldn't really get rid of all the birch trees, so we kept 2 trees, and we had to change. We'd cut the building around them, so the building is kind of an L-shaped building that wraps around these 2 trees, which then became very important to protect as we built the building. So I was doing paintings of the site. So the base of the building is where it's a retaining wall to the ground around is concrete up to 3 feet, and then it's a timber structure above that. So this is when the concrete was going in, and these are the birch trees and the little court that they have caused us to cut out, which we're very pleased that they have done. So the downstairs studio, there's a studio upstairs and a studio downstairs. I work downstairs because I go in and out to the garden, and John works upstairs. He's often writing and looking out at the dome. So the spaces are open. It's an open plan, open section space, but there are different moments of connection with the garden and the furniture, because it's quite small because of the trees. The furniture is built in and designed around the shapes that the building takes around the trees. And it's a place where, in fact, we're just beginning to work out how to work here and what we're doing here when we're in our office, when we're in the studio. we started holding events and discussions and seminars there, which I think is probably something in the back of our minds when we built it, but now we're starting to do that. And we have this inside-outside relationship also, that the lower court, which is dug out, which is planted and will eventually become overgrown, we hope, with plants, has a very strong connection with the downstairs studio, and my desk looks straight out into that. And then the stairs, the beginning of the stairs is concrete, within the 3 feet connection, and there's a stove and a meeting place here, which is where we hold the seminars. And then everything becomes timber above a certain level. The stairs winds up to the upper studio, where there's a meeting place looking down to below. And it's made in Irish Douglas fir, which is a very beautiful material. Unfortunately, there's very little structural grade timber growing in Ireland, and we were lucky to be able to find this, and we're still trying to work out how to build in timber in the future. And the spaces are quite low because they're always looking down to the garden, except where you're looking up to the dome, which is the corner studio that John has. And then on the lane side, there are planters built into the building. It's a brick building. The planters give a kind of privacy to us and to other people. And then at night, it's a kind of glowing thing at the end of our garden and on this lane. And I'm going to finish by talking about collaboration, conversations with others. About 12 or more years ago, a furniture maker called Joseph Walsh, who makes very exotic, very curvy, very beautiful, and incredibly crafted furniture, who's based in Cork in the south of Ireland, contacted us and asked would we be interested in doing a collaboration. He wanted to kind of challenge himself, and he knew that our work was mostly not curvy. So he said, would we work on a desk with him, a wall-hung desk, that we would design it and he would make it. So we made this desk, which we called Falling Dansu, which is very beautifully made, and everything slides and moves. And I was first making sketches, and then we gradually developed this. And the desk part folds up, and it's very lovely. And he launched it at the Milan Furniture Fair, and I don't think he sold any of them. But anyway, there are 2. We have 1, and he has 1, the 2 prototypes. And then Joseph, somehow we just got into the habit of working with him, and we were preparing our vessel for the 2012 Biennale. We were trying to design this structure, which was a kind of space you could move through. Felt a bit like a sacred space, but was secular. And Joseph said, well, why don't I make a model in oak? And so he made this beautiful model in oak, and then we added gold leaf, which became part of the exhibition in Venice. And then later yet, after we won the competition in London, the Olympicopolis, the original design was quite different, and the V&A was in a big site at the end, and this was our design for the V&A, which had a different brief, including a lot of archive storage space, and it was with huge cantilevered galleries and open spaces underneath, but then it didn't go ahead. And somehow Joseph happened to have a huge block of alabaster, and he thought, why don't I make a model, kind of a model that's also a sculpture about your... So we call it Unfinished Museum. It's just like a way of fixing a project that didn't happen, but it's a very beautiful thing because it's alabaster and light comes through it. And then a few years ago, probably after the lockdown, he approached us again and said, look, I think I'd like to, why don't we move up a scale in our collaborations? He said, I think people have this mistaken idea that craft is about making little pieces of jewellery or, pottery. He said, but he was really interested in the idea that our traditional crafts include building and thatch and timber and stone, and said, why don't we make a kind of show, a little exhibition project, which is about making a structure using these things, using local materials and local craftspeople. And he has an event every year called Making in his studio workshop in Cork, where people come from all over the world to talk about craft and design and making. And there's architects and other kinds of people at it, and he's had, we've spoken, Diller Scofidio, Grafton, this year Shigeru Ban. It's a very interesting event. So these structures were in a way to be for this event, and they would become gathering places, but not with any particular function. And we have always been very interested in vernacular architecture and just about how walls and gates and the sort of pacing of things, the use of thatch. Joseph's own house is that farmhouse on the right. His grandfather's farmhouse burned down about 15 years ago, and he got it rebuilt and brought in thatchers, and that's where he first got to know the thatchers and the stonemasons. And he now lives in this very simple house. So he suggested timber and thatch. So over Christmas, John made these sketches, and instead of doing 1 pavilion, he drew 3. And Joseph said, oh yeah, that looks really exciting, but you know, I'm not sure about 3, like I did say 1. And he said, I know, what we'll do is we'll build 1 this year, and then we'll build 2 more in the following 2 years. And we said, great, okay. So we started working on this project, and we moved from sketches straight into models, thinking about timber structure, working with, I mean, that's a thatcher and a carpenter there, working with the makers about how you could use these materials in these ways. It is also built in Irish Douglas fir. The structure is raised up off the ground, held on stone, which is stone quarried in the field beside the site. And then Joseph has a lot of connections with Japan, so somehow Japanese carpenters came over and advised us on, there's a lot of dry Japanese carpentry joints in the structure. And it was just a really interesting experience, building it without really with drawings. The model was on the site. We worked with the craftspeople, with the makers. And a thing that we hadn't expected was that the stone, there's a retaining wall at one point because the ground is higher, and there's this very beautiful stonework done by a man who came down from Donegal, the other end of Ireland, and there's a stone floor, and all the stone is quarried on the site. So we finished this structure, and it was there for the making in, and people played music in it. Martin Hayes, whose music you heard as you came in, played in this, and lots of other musicians, and people gathered and could stand in there having a drink when it's raining. And then it just sits in the landscape and is gradually weathering. And it was really interesting trying to think how you can make thatch using traditional techniques, but also trying to make something that has a slightly more abstract shape. And so that was a great experience. And then when we came to do the second one, we all thought, why don't we do it in stone? Now that we've started, the stone wall at the base of the other one seems so interesting, and the stone is quarried on the site. So we had a lot of sessions with archaeologists and stonemasons and a blacksmith who has somehow become part of all these projects. This is in Joseph's kitchen, just discussing the design with sketches from the notebooks and then early models we made in the office. And what we wanted to do was to make a structure which had the kind of power of there's a lot of ancient dry stone, mostly chapels, buildings in the Irish landscape. And we wanted to explore the qualities of stone and the weight of stone and the structural capacity of stone. And in a way, it's an experiment, not about how you might actually build a modern building, but more about what this material has to offer. And so we had the idea that that the shape would be more prismatic and maybe more dramatic than the old chapels, but that inside it would use corbelled stonework, so it's a kind of softer form inside and a more angled form outside. And you might just see there's some pieces of pink and yellow string. Those strings were erected at the very beginning of the construction, and they were the guide for the masons. And it ended up taking almost 9 months, and those pieces of string were there for 9 months, and they were the way in which the shapes of everything were measured and gauged. And it was just, it started with 4 or 5 masons, and by the end we had 12 from all over Ireland, and a woman from France, and eventually some Japanese masons who came in and built the boundary walls around the outside. And we learned so much from them, and we had to use a slightly different kind of stone for some of the more cut elements. So this is the interior where the curved shapes come out, and that model on the left is a kind of inside-outside, showing how by using corbelling you get a kind of softer, different space inside, which is also an acoustic space, which has also had music played in it. And so it was finished not quite in time for the conference last year because it took so long, but it's finished now. And I mean, these buildings, they don't have a function in the sense that there's a brief and a client, and there's no planning permission and there's no contract, and it was just such a liberation to work in something where there's a kind of freedom, but there's also the constraint, which is the material and the craft. So this is when the Japanese stonemasons arrived, and what was really interesting is they could use the stones that the Irish masons didn't want, because the Irish masons wanted flat horizontal stones. Japanese guys were building these boundary Japanese style walls, and they wanted kind of more rounded stones, so there was an interesting kind of dialogue that they could use the stones that the other guys didn't want. And so these two structures sit, the passage house and the stone vessel, as we call it, in relation to each other. And then we had to think about the third one. So the third one we felt should not really be a building, and there was a sense that we needed something to pull these two together. And they're in a field with this hedge, a kind of a ditch and a hedge, which defines one side of it. So we decided we would make a theatre, an outdoor theatre, and we call it a hedge theatre, which is an Irish building type. and the hedge is the backdrop to the theatre. So we wanted to make something like a kind of ancient auditorium, but we were looking at the tree rings and thinking that it would not have a regular pattern of seats, but that it would somehow vary and that the curves would swell and change in relation to the way the land sits, and that you might want places for people to gather on different platforms. So it's a little amphitheatre which uses some big stones to hold the ends of its seating, and then the seating wraps around and it faces towards this hedge, which faces the other buildings. In fact, we didn't cut it into the ground because we didn't want to do that. We felt that would be wrong. We were able to move earth to make a kind of hill. So what's happened is that there's a new hill which is now green. The grass was just starting to grow. And then there's an entrance cut, which you can see here, that you come in, and then you arrive into this space, which is just defined by these stone edges for the seats. And then there's a timber stage, which was built by Joseph's workshop, which is not permanent. It gets taken away. It's not. It's dry. It's just the weight of the things hold it in place. So it can be. It has been dismounted. It's not there now. But this was it being built for the Making In event this year, and there were performances on that first. A Japanese kabuki theatre, which was quite exotic and extreme, the kind of Irish landscape with Japanese kabuki. And then on the final day, there was a concert at lunchtime by Martin Hayes, a traditional fiddler whose music was playing as you came in, who's a friend now and a colleague of ours with whom we often talk about the relationship between music and architecture and structure. But in the background are the two other pavilions, one of which you can see here. And in a way, this project has just been an opportunity for us to speculate about craft and building. We're now looking at, that's the 3 pavilions done. We're now looking at another 4th project, which is more practical, which is an idea about trying to make a kind of prototype house, a maker's house, a lean house made very simply and cheaply using maybe prefabricated timber. And we're also experimenting with rammed earth on the site here in Cork. So we have to wait and see how that turns out. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Maybe I'll start. I've had the pleasure of being with you this afternoon and learning many of the stories, intimate stories about not only this project, but others that you've been working on. And I am curious, I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about your work is that there are many practices that when they move from small projects to big projects that shift in scale, there's a tendency to lose control either of the voicing of the project through an idea about craft or this question of place that you've been, and the conversations that you're having, that you've shared with us throughout this lecture. Tell us about this, about your different approaches in shifting scale and or the same approaches in shifting scales between, let's say, these small, very surgical things in the landscape and these much larger projects like the V&A?
I would say it's the same approach. I mean, we've sometimes, in the early years when we were doing small buildings and additions, and sometimes we might be designing a bench or something, and in a way we always felt it was always the same thing. It was always trying to think about something in terms of its use, in terms of its client, in terms of its place. I think we were lucky that quite early in our practice we did the Irish Film Centre, which was relatively big, but also involved a lot of existing historic buildings. So we had, on the one hand, quite big new things, but also lessons to be learned by working with existing buildings, which I think are really important and really interesting. I don't think we really, I mean, we were so pleased to move up in scale that I think it was just a pleasure to do that. I would say we use the same starting point and techniques. I mean, we sometimes talk about starting with the kind of immersion, and that immersion would be an understanding of the physical nature of the place, but also the historic, the social, the client's brief, the kind of ethos. I mean, I think that's really important. the ethos of the client and the organisation, and of what they need their building to feel like, you know, what kind of character it should have, how it should work for people. So I think that's the same for a big or a small building. I mean, when we went to Budapest, it was really interesting because we'd never been in that city before we went to do the competition. But we knew that we really wanted to make a Budapest building. You know, we didn't want to bring something we'd already been doing in Ireland or in London and drop it in Budapest. We wanted to start with the place, with the city, and with the client to think about that. So I think there's a lot. You know, if you do really immerse yourself in the layers and aspects of a project, there's so much to be gained from that information and material that it really does give you a starting point. And I think we always start with sketches. I mean, John and I, because of when we were educated and started, we still draw in pencil on paper. We make a lot of models in the office. Not me, but office models are made in the office, physical models, and that's a really important part of feeling a way into projects also. So, I mean, in a way, while some of our buildings are big scale, they've tended to be made out of a lot of, you know, quite a lot of small. We are now working on an indoor sports building, which is really interesting with the timber structure. But we've hardly made buildings with huge spaces. I mean, we've done some theatres, the one in Belfast, the one in London that's finishing. But our buildings tend to be made with a kind of relatively intimate, recognisable scale of space. So we're actually quite pleased to be now moving into something that feels, in a way, more generic and bigger scale.
I have a question. It stems from two observations. One, this continual use of masonry.
Yeah.
And second, this effect of chiaroscuro, the encounter of light from dark spaces and sort of the shaping of light from spaces. And I'm curious if there's a relationship between the two effects, the use of materiality, sort of the shaping of spaces, and if it comes up in the design process.
Yes, I think it does. I think that's probably true, that we are interested in dark and light, in containment and opening. And it's true that masonry works well for that. I mean, obviously, like everybody else, we're having to think now about how we build, what materials we use. And I think we would want our buildings we always want our buildings to have material presence, to, if possible, be made of materials which don't need to be painted and maintained, but can develop with age, a kind of patina. I mean, that, I think, is probably one of the big challenges of moving away from masonry to other kinds of construction, that we have to just find a way to adapt to that. But I would say that's true, that walls are good at, you know, containing and opening out to light and to big and small spaces. And I think that, like, working, the advantage of working with those watercolour drawings is that you can make drawings where you don't get distracted by the pattern of windows or what, you know, that just show the main moves of solid and void, or lightness and darkness or shade. So I think we will always be interested in that. We'll always be interested in, I remember one of the houses we did, the client, who was a really interesting psychiatrist, she said, I want you to know that I want some spaces in my house that are dark. She said, I don't like this thing that everything modern has to be fully bright. And that was really interesting. She just wanted this sense that there are spaces with different light qualities within a building. But I think that it does always respond to use and to clients. And, you know, so we're designing building, like the theatre building. I mean, it's really challenging to have a huge wall that's got no windows, and think how do you manage that? And there is a kind of abstractness about the composition of openings in big walls. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I mean, to some extent it's an observation, and I think it's true that chiaroscuro and in particular the idea of dimension, and that even if a building is quite small, by making something very small, it can make the rest of it feel quite big, which is similar to what happens with light and darkness as well, I would say. Moisen had it.
Hi, Sheila.
Hi, Moisen.
Thank you so much. Really, it's really wonderful to see you working. When you go on holiday, you make me feel guilty.
It's not.
Because
it's a different kind of work.
But you're working. But I have like I guess a simple question. It's really interesting to see the collaboration with Joseph and other colleagues at the end, and to see how you find that both kind of joyful, but also it's producing somehow things that are unexpected.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, because I think when you did the London collaboration with Allays and Morrison, they did the master plan. And I was sitting here wondering whether you could use some string or something in the urban context to actually also produce kind of alternative ways of relating buildings at a big scale in the city. Do you have any thoughts how this last project, this kind of collaboration, might actually have some urban possibilities?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, there were a lot of challenges in that London project because really, I would say they were trying to put an enormous amount of building on a very small site. And so in the end, we have this one long space, which is with the steps. But and then there's one enormous building, Allays and Morrison's London College of Fashion, and in a way, it's kind of hard for the other buildings to work and scale with that. So even at the time of the competition, because we knew there was a lot of building on a small site, we were using references like Central Park or something, that you're in Central Park and you're just looking at buildings and some of them are tall and some of them are not tall. And this place will be very much observed from the Olympic Park, which is actually a very beautiful park in London and is getting better as it develops. But yes, I think that in making, if there's any space to kind of move in a master plan, I do like the idea that there are kind of lines that connect and that you could do that. And we're working on some competitions now with master plans where I think we're hoping that we can have a bit more space around the buildings and maybe more sense of connection between the scales of things. I mean, we sometimes say about that project in London that it was described as a master plan competition, but it wasn't really a master plan, because a master plan is something that has a kind of generic aspect to it. That was really an urban design or a design for a particular set of buildings quite closely brought together, and didn't have the kind of scope that sometimes a master plan has to look at typology or repetition or, you know, the special against the typical. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's what's so interesting about a project like this is it is, in a way, an invitation to play. It's an invitation to explore and to research, but it's also an invitation to play and to think about how things are made. And what's so interesting is working with someone like him, whose own work is so very different from ours, that yet at every stage, I mean, he's involved and we're involved at every decision. We're always able to find common ground, and that's been really great. And I'm really looking forward now to doing the next one, which is, in a way, more practical, that we're thinking about, you know, how can you make a structure which is affordable, and because I mean, Ireland, like here, houses are so expensive, and part of it is to do with people who work with Joseph, he's near Kinsale, which is a very expensive tourist part of the country, and his people, he's thinking they can't afford houses, so we thought we might start by building a kind of model house in his land, and then think about how that might be prototyped in some way. And I'd be quite interested in trying to make some kind of timber prefabricated structures. So it kind of moves between reality and fantasy, this project. And then when he has these events and there's 400 people and there's people from Italy who are the oldest family business in the world who make bells, and someone else talking about making wheels, and people talking about architecture and weaving, and it's an amazing kind of intense event with this thing of everybody talking about making and design and seeing the connections between different disciplines and crafts. So we don't regularly teach anymore. We teach irregularly quite a lot, but in a way, this project over the last 3 years has been, you know, we go a lot down and spend a few days just working together and researching books about old Irish stone buildings or whatever the relevant thing is, and bringing these Japanese masons and Japanese carpenters and thinking about different crafts and ways of doing things. And yes, I would hope that it has, for us, a kind of a usefulness beyond the things we've made into opening the mind to other stuff.
Sheila, thank you so much for the lecture. I have two questions. I think throughout the lecture, I had an impression that this project really feels like landscape in many ways, in the ways in which you create multiple levels of ground where public sort of navigate through the buildings, or how the building sort of connects to the larger fabric of the city. I think your sort of references to an Oli plan and the ways in which you document your swimming or your walking around the city felt like looking at a landscape architect working on a building scale, or vice versa. In that sense, do you have a feel, and especially the last project almost feels like a landscape project. In that sense, my first question is, do you sometimes feel like a disciplinary boundary as an architect, and you feel like you're pushing towards another direction? And my second question is, when you talk about immersion in cities or places, like, how do you immerse yourself, and how do you reflect on your immersion? I think in a way it's quite well represented, but I also wanted to ask.
Okay, well, the first one, I think we are really interested in land, and we're really interested in there not being a boundary between a building and the place it's in. So we are very interested in the idea of the building extending beyond and the outside coming in. And that is partly to do with threshold. Now, we've been lucky to have a lot of cultural projects where the clients want to invite people to come in. So we've never had to design, big bank headquarters where they're trying to say, only come in if you're supposed to be here, whatever. And I'm very interested in what it is that makes people feel able to enter a building, because I think it can be quite intimidating to approach a building. And that's part of the reason why we probably use walls, and because I think that big glass facades as you approach them can be a little intimidating. And we also make these kind of, and this is where the landscape comes in between spaces that might be outside but covered, or where the landscape comes in a bit. So there's a kind of contingent space where you haven't fully committed yet. You're not really sure if you are going in, but at least you can stand under this canopy and think about it. So, and I mean, I do think that the built landscape, I mean, there's hardly a site in our country where the landscape is not to some extent constructed or shaped or formed by human intervention. And so I think that architecture is part of that intervention. So yes, we are very interested. I mean, one thing on that project in Cork, there's a horticulturalist who works with us on that, and he's been doing a lot of planting around those places, and actually he's been advising us in our studio as well, and the planting hasn't really grown up yet, but it's about different kinds of plants and how they're going to work. So I think we're really interested in that collaboration also with people who know about plants. Your second question, which was about immersion, yeah. Well, it was in Budapest, the university. Well, first we walked the city and we read books about the history and looked about architects and visited places. And obviously there was surveys of the building, but we also, there's 13 departments in that postgraduate university, so we went and spent a few days, both John and myself and some people from our team, meeting people in every academic department, but also people in every other, like admin people who did the cleaning, the catering. So we had a set of meetings across 2 days, which were amazingly useful and informative, where we asked people the same questions, and then we asked them different questions as well about what they wanted, what they felt was the ethos of their university, what their interests were in connecting with the city, and they ranged from really practical to really impractical, or to really open-minded. To the people in the legal department said, well, can you show me your plans? And we said, no, we're talking to you. We won't say anything until we've seen your plans. And we said, okay. the guys in psychology were, come in and have a glass of wine. Yeah, let's discuss the concept of education in the city. And it was actually a wonderful 2 days. So that, and that is, even that understanding that a place has multiple cultures, and all those people need to be happy with the place you make. The man from mathematics just wanted blackboards. He just kept saying, and then in the middle he turned and said, you hate mathematics, don't you? And we said, no, why do you think that? He said, I know you do, everybody does, people hate mathematics. And we said, how about connecting to the city? I don't care about the city, now can I have more blackboards? Anyway, so that's one kind of immersion. I think time, I mean, just spending time in places and looking at them, sketching them, photographing them. But I definitely think the business about understanding what the people are going to do in the building and who they are, and what, you know, without being intrusive, what their aspirations are is very much part of that immersion. I think you have to understand what's going to happen in the building before you can work for people.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm curious about the role of technical drawing in your practice.
Mm-hmm.
So often in architecture, the architect uses the technical drawing to ensure fidelity to a concept. But in your case, where you're working with craft, it would seem that the technical drawing, overdrawing might limit the types of collaborations and things that would come up through the people you're working with. And I'm curious how at different scales of drawing or of building you work back and forth in technical drawing. Yeah,
I mean, that has changed a lot during the course of our practice, because when we started, everything was drawn by hand on ink or pencil and paper, and then we started using computers, but was simple, kind of 2D programs and without communication. So, we'd make our drawings. And so, you saw us say in the we sometimes try to do quite technical drawings at the early stage, and the ones that Andrew made, or are quite technical about material and construction. But of course, like everybody else, we have to work in. Now it's basically always Revit. Everything we do, we resisted Revit for a long time because we felt it was very crude, and then we said, okay, what you've got to do is embrace these programs and then try to, as much as you can, to make them your own, to kind of own them rather than to have them oppressing you. I quite like, because I'm not doing that myself, but I quite like the way with Revit that you can sit down with someone and you can say, okay, let's walk into, you can walk around the building, and we're going, that's so cool. But I think we have a lot of people working on technical drawings in Revit and other programs as well, but then there's a lot of hand sketching over those drawings also to think about how to make things. But the only way now, the project like this one is totally different, because we're just working, we're working with stonemasons and carpenters on a site and they become part of the project. It's their project as much as it's ours, and we're changing things according to their expertise. But in normal projects, it's not like that at all. When I started practice, it was when we did the Irish Film Centre. I could go on site and discuss with the contractor, who knew more than I did how to do something, and we'd discuss it, and then we'd agree we'd do something that either was what he said or a combined thing, and we'd redraw it. Now you can't do things like that. You can't make decisions on site. So everything is drawn, everything is looked at and studied, and throughout lockdown, when we were doing those buildings in London, which had a very strange form of contract with every trade a different contract. We had our team was doing hundreds and hundreds of drawings of every single thing you could see in the building, so that they would be, and they have to be done in these programs that are shareable with everybody else. So I think we tried to move between hand drawing, making specific drawings rather than just modelling something. So making a drawing off a piece of a model, and then just and using physical models, but obviously not. Physical models don't that often get into absolute technical detail. They might get, obviously, structural detail is studied in physical models. So I think we're trying to navigate all of the different media that we have to navigate in order to be able to work.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Lovely lecture. We're really grateful that you came. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.